Welcome back to Democracy Now! The music was A-Sex Twins. We're talking with Ambassador Heraldo Munoz, Chilean Ambassador to the United Nations. Formerly, he was the president of the UN Security Council. And we're talking about his new book, A Solitary War, a Diplomat's Chronicle of the Iraq War and its Lessons. I'd like to ask you to switch channels a little bit. The situation in Latin America today. Obviously, there have been, while the United States has been involved in this war in Iraq, there have been enormous changes occurring on the continent. And your sense of the direction that the continent is going to in terms of more popular governments throughout the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's the impression in the United States, in some press at least, that Latin America is going red, that is going towards leftist regimes. And I think that Latin America is going into all the colors of the rainbow. Variety is what you observe. You have, for example, the last elected President Calderon of Mexico is a conservative man. And you have social democrats like Lula in Brazil, or my own president Bachelet in Chile, which leads a varied coalition, including Christian Democrats, etc. And you have President Chavez with a more left or populist, as some want to say, along with Nicaragua, a different Ortega nevertheless, and perhaps also Bolivia and Ecuador. But you have a Colombian government which is evidently of a liberal sign, or a moderate left in Uruguay. So my perception is that this is quite a varied hemisphere that we find, that you cannot simply put into a one box and define it as being homogeneous. It's not. The good thing is that there is democracy, as it hasn't been the case for decades. So far, even though there has been instability, there have been elections and no military governments since the 1980s. And that is, I think, one important thing. Second, hyperinflation has been left in the past, and governments are increasingly worried about income distribution, about social and economic justice, and not merely about economic growth, which is fundamental, evidently, in order to be able to advance and to distribute to all of the levels of the population, particularly the poor and the downtrodden that are always left behind. So my feeling is that there are different roads to do that. It is one particular situation is Venezuela, that has abundant resources. Let us remember that when President Chavez arrived in office, the barrel of oil was $20. Today it is $110. So he's got possibilities that other governments don't have in the region that don't have oil. So that we're all trying to do our best to tackle the challenges of strengthening democracy, deepening it, and advancing social justice, because there's a danger that people become frustrated because they say, okay, democracy is fine, but we see growth, but the growth doesn't enter my home, and this is a challenge that we have in the region.
And the fissures that have developed over some issues, we were talking before the show about your trip to Antarctica with the Secretary General of the UN, the issue of climate change, and how the different governments in Latin America have been taking positions on climate change. For instance, Lula has been obviously in the forefront of the move toward biofuels, while others are very critical of that as the way to begin to the impact that it will have on food situation. Your sense of how the conflicts over climate change are working themselves out among the Latin American nations?
Well, the first thing is to say that climate change is not an academic matter. This is a real danger, and I have seen it. Being in the Antarctic in January with the Secretary General, we went to the Antarctic Peninsula, to the Chilean base there, and we saw the evidence. One of the huge blocks of ice called Larsen A, that was more than 300 square kilometers, disappeared in 1995. Larsen B, much larger, disappeared in 2001. These are pieces, glaciers, that are larger than the size of Rhode Island. And that means that there's a tremendous danger for all of us. The Antarctic Peninsula, the western side, and you showed it today with what is happening with one part of it. If all that were to melt, scientists estimate that the oceans would rise about 6 meters. That would mean that some islands would disappear and the effects would be catastrophic. So that this is not academic, this is a reality that affects Latin American countries to begin with, because in our Patagonia, we see ice fields receding. And this is changing the climate, and that has economic effects and social effects. So we in Latin America are very committed because it's hitting us. Let me just say in addition that when there was a depletion of the ozone layer depletion was around the poles. So that in the south of Chile, at times of the year, children were not allowed to play outside because of the harmful rays. And eye diseases increased dramatically. So we were paying the consequences of others that were emitting gases that were depleting the ozone layer. And the same thing is happening with global warming. What are the answers? Well, I think biofuels is part of the answer. There are some, I should say, that feel that is not, that creates other complications. But I think that it's a mix of alternative fuels, of non-renewable resources, where we need to put a lot more financing so that developing countries have access to that and make it cheaper. Electric cars, wind energy, solar energy, etc. And in addition to that, we have to have mitigation, we have to have savings, we have to change our consumption patterns. So there's a combination of measures that are being negotiated within the United Nations. It shouldn't be done outside the United Nations, and we hope that it will conclude by 2009 in a post-Kyoto regime. Otherwise, then we have to prepare for the worst. So we hope that world leaders will take up this challenge in the next couple of years. And
briefly, you helped to negotiate the free trade agreement between Chile and Europe. Yes. Your sense of the battles over the free trade agreements, in the sense that there are not fair trade agreements when they come to when they deal with many countries of the South. Well, my feeling is that free trade is positive, in the sense that developing countries through free trade have access to markets that creates better jobs, better quality jobs, and stimulates growth. But evidently that has to be done with adequate safeguards for labor and the environment, so that this is not at the expense of ruining the environment or going over the rights of workers. If those two aspects are included, I'm all for taking advantage of a globalized economy. Not to do it would be to try to cover the sun with a finger. I don't think that that's possible. So the question is not whether you are for free trade or not. It is for what type of free trade agreements are you for. And with the case of Europe, it's not only a free trade agreement that includes these aspects, but also that includes scientific cooperation, where we benefit by scientific cooperation from Europeans, and there's a political dialogue also included. Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Heraldo Munoz, ambassador, Chilean ambassador to the United Nations. Formerly, he was the president of the UN Security Council, and his new book, A Solitary War, A Diplomat's Chronicle of the Iraq War and Its Lesson. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.